I know a lot of useless athletes, mostly because, well, there's nothing particularly special about their sport. But sometimes, mostly because of culture, we give athletes a lot of credit that they don't necessarily deserve outside of their very narrow scope of practice, as in far more credit than they deserve outside of their sport. And I get it. I understand why. The ability to run fast or punch hard or kick a ball down a field, if you don't know how to do those things, they almost look like superpowers. But none of them are. Every one of those things, everything you see in sports, those are all trainable skills. And sure, there are upper limits to how fast or how far you and I can run, or how hard we can punch, or how well we can play soccer. But you can only find those upper limits by training them. And very few of us are going to do that. Or we're even given the opportunity early enough in our lives to decide whether that's what we wanted to do. I mean, if you could go back in time and specialize in a sport, would you? And if you did, you'd have to understand that you'd be giving up everything else that you know. You wouldn't be able to do anything else, because specialization is really the only way to become an expert in any domain. Running, punching, soccer, it doesn't make a difference what it is. Specialization comes at a cost. You might be very useful in a very singular pursuit. You lose utility in a general sense. You essentially become more useless, not useful. And this isn't necessarily a problem for people who make it to the upper echelons of their chosen sport. It tends to work out well for them, but it sure is a problem for the typical washout or hobbyist or weekend warrior. It's not so great for them, partly because there's a risk of over-identification in something like that. That's compounded by probably not being very good at it. And that creates a situation where a person spends an inordinate amount of time and resources on something that returns very little, which, okay, that's great if we don't have any other attachments, priorities, or responsibilities. But if our friends, families, and careers suffer because of that focus for what is ostensibly a hobby, well, wow, that's not great. Because that right there sounds more like an addiction than a pastime. And it's an addiction stemming from an over-identification with a specialization. I'm just using sports as an example because it works really well. But this could apply to anything, and we need to guard against that, because our goal as human beings should be to strive to be as useful in as many different areas as we can be. In lieu of breadth, which makes us more useful to more people, the next best thing, I guess, is depth. But if that's the case, then we need to be as successful as possible in that specialization, to the point that we are more useful to more people because of how good we are at the specialization that we do. Or not. I could be totally wrong. However, I will say that if you volunteer at sporting events or act as an ambassador for a particular type of sport or event, that does demonstrate utility over and above competing in that sport. When I was a supervisor and I would see something like volunteering on a resume, I always paid special attention to that. I mostly ignored the accomplishments a person had in a sport, but I definitely favored volunteerism. Because playing a sport, that's all well and good. But if you're part of the infrastructure that makes that sport possible for others, that's pretty cool. And that might be the key takeaway that I'm trying to impart here. It's the lesson that I would like everybody to consider when it comes to hobby-adjacent hobbies or career-adjacent careers, or any combination thereof or therein. Because volunteerism speaks to another level of commitment. Not so much to the sport, but to the people. By comparison, people who only compete in a sport and never volunteer aren't really in it for the sport. They're in it for themselves. They're in it for whatever personal glory that they can achieve. Whereas people that participate on both sides of a hobby both sides of a sport, well, they're generating goodwill. And goodwill is, well, good. Mostly because goodwill is useful on a resume or in real life. It's definitely more useful than a participation ribbon or a finisher's medal. That's a certainty. Another option is to just buy a pickup truck. Everybody needs a friend with a pickup truck.